My name is Zoe Pham, and I will be presenting my close reading assignment on Then There Were None by Elizabeth Lindsay. Right, so here are the sequence of clips that I will be analyzing, and I will analyze the latter 3 shots.
Hollywood built a fantasy around us, idyllic and savage, mystical and silly. We were portrayed as carefree natives, when in reality, we were struggling.
Okay, so I'll move on to my close reading, touching upon how Lindsay contrasts the fantasy media portrayal of Hawaii versus the reality in these 3 shots. Here's the first.
Idyllic and savage, mystical and silly. Idyllic.
All right, so the first thing I want to touch upon is the use of camera work in transforming these still images into something that draws attention to different subjects and centers them. The first shot transitions into this one through a jump cut, zooming out and panning right from the image on the left. Here you can see a Hawaiian woman in the background, centered, obscured a little bit by people in the extreme foreground. As the camera zooms out, however, and you can see the full image, she is almost obscured by the darkness in the background and in the distance from the camera. In this extreme long shot, her stature is very small, along with the other Hawaiian people surrounding in the background of the image, opposed to the white couple in the front. This white man has his hand outstretched in kind of a traditional stereotypical Hawaiian garb, maybe engaging in a practice taken to kind of commemorate this image or to promote this tourist portrayal of Hawaiians as idyllic and savage, mystical and silly. And this use of zooming in and out causes us to question who to look at, whose narratives to focus on, and what does this mean to the people participating in this for the Native Hawaiians and seeing their culture being portrayed this way. To keep moving forward, I think the composition is really special in framing this use of foreground versus background in how it all goes together. So you can see that the white couple is centered, centering this white settler experience of Hawaiian culture, such as the dress, the practice, and the spirituality, and the Hawaiian audience in the background, very small against the shot, are outsiders looking inward, unable to partake in their own culture. And here I've highlighted this use of foreground and background to differentiate this outsider-insider experience because of the distance and use of light and depth from the camera, kind of blurring their faces of the Hawaiians in the background and highlighting the white people in the center. Lindsay talks about a specific example of how Hawaiians are excluded from practicing their own culture. She says that the hula, which to Hawaiians was a sacred and spiritual dance, now required licenses to ensure it was done purely for entertainment and not a pagan religious practice, as foreigners sometimes called it. This literal exclusion is shown here in this photograph because of the foreground and background and how how these white people are using this culture in this way. Here is my next shot.
We were portrayed as carefree natives. We were
Right, so moving on, this shot is a graphic match of the one previous to this. It uses the zooming in and out of the camera to frame different subjects. In the left, you can see the initial image of this kind of disgusted, disgruntled face of most likely a Hawaiian man looking straight into the camera, all while Lindsay talks about this media portrayal of Hawaiians as carefree natives. But as the shot zooms out to the right, His face is obscured along with many other Hawaiians, and you can't really tell their expression. It's kind of blurry. They're very small against the screen because of their distance from the camera. Um, Whereas the happy honeymoon visage of these white tourists in kind of the lei and Hawaiian print are very clear to see. The use of foreground and background are also used, and I think it's interesting to see how Hawaiians are present yet not present in each of these photos, present but not participating in it, and only their culture is being interacted with for these white tourists. And Trask talks about this participation on page 17. Burdened with commodification of Hawaiian culture and exploitation of our people, Hawaiians exist in an occupied country whose hostage people are forced to witness and for many to participate in our own collective humiliation as tourist artifacts of the first world. Seen aptly in this photo because of the framing. And these two photos earlier have had this kind of the Hawaiian music, which we learn from Lindsay's film is mostly written by like white Americans rather than Hawaiians, as she narrates how Hawaiians are depicted as carefree, idyllic and savage, mystical and silly. And here's the last shot.
But in reality, we were struggling.
So this shot is very drastic in the camera work. While there is a jump cut, there is no movement of the camera at all. It makes it kind of abrupt, the image that she's portraying, which is framed and produced in a very different way from a different source as well. It's kind of a documentary, archival-like photo of subjects which are actually featuring Native Hawaiians who are aware and present of what's going on. They're not dressed up at all. They're barefoot, and the photo isn't staged. Contrasting these kind of tourist portrayals of Hawaii and alluding to poverty, houselessness that many real Hawaiians face because of their colonization and more. And I think it's a really great match to Lindsay's narration that in reality Hawaiians are struggling, opposed to this media portrayal. In context of the film, I thought it was really interesting how Lindsay contrasts U.S. media portrayal of Hawaii versus the reality. She does this with the different types of footage and where they're sourced from, such as the first two shots were maybe advertisements or Hollywood films to promote tourism for white Americans, whereas the last shot is kind of a simpler documentary, maybe archival photo of Native Hawaiian people, not trying to promote or sell anything. Here are other two shots that do this earlier in the film, or around this later in the film. In the top, Lindsay talks about how Hawaiians have been portrayed as hostile in the media when being evicted from their own land, perhaps. And the bottom, the living conditions of people in Hawaii, whereas the first are all the hotels and places maybe for white American settlers or Asian settlers, and the living conditions of actual Native Hawaiians. So more on the historical context. Here's a timeline broadly of Hawaiian history. I mostly wanted to highlight how colonization and statehood of Hawaii, and annexation in 1898 has spiked most of U.S. tourism, Hollywood films, and cultivating this cultural image of Hawaii and commodifying it to promote tourism, and how the U.S. has gradually taken away Hawaiians' power by asserting their claim in the Tyler Doctrine, transferring their power to an all-white legislature, using income to subvert any voting or political power for Native Hawaiians or Asian laborers, and more. And I think it's really interesting to see how this cultural image of Hawaii persists even today as a tourist honeymoon location in racial paradise. And to go more into this, Trask talks about this reality versus the media portrayal. She says that Hawaiians as a people register the same profile as other indigenous groups controlled by the United States: high unemployment, catastrophic health problems, low educational attainment, large numbers institutionalized in the military prisons, occupational ghettoization and poorly paid jobs, and increasing outmigration that amounts to diaspora. For visitors to Hawaii, these statements are quite shocking because the Hollywood tourist poster image of my homeland as a racial paradise with happy natives waiting to share their culture with everyone and anyone is a familiar global commodity. And it was interesting to see how cultural inferiority, or more specifically, white supremacy, has played into the colonization of Hawaii as well as in the Philippines, and kind of racism and culture as capital in the US. Takaki says in the Philippines, the people of this new American possession were seen by their guardians as backward natives, to be civilized by Americans seeking to carry the white man's burden. I found this interesting as well because Lindsay earlier talks about how the hula was seen as a pagan religious practice and culturally inferior to missionaries, white missionaries. So Choi says in the US, white supremacy, encouraged by white man's claims of a manifest destiny to inherit the riches of America, viewed all other races to be culturally, mentally, and physically inferior. So more on colonialism and sovereignty in Hawaii, which has been a long struggle as early as like 1845, around close to annexation. A lot of thousands of Hawaiians petitioned their king and council to resist foreign influences, such as like foreign officers, foreigners as Hawaiian subjects, and who were taking up land. And in the master plan, I thought it was really interesting how the rights to self-determination and self-development, as well as traditional activities, were all equally considered in promoting Hawaiian sovereignty and reclaiming the ownership of their land, culture, rights, and more, all tying in together. And it was very cool to think about how sovereignty is played in as a tool to exploit Pacific Islanders and their labor and resources for the U.S., and how the Philippines was granted sovereignty, but for Filipino exclusion. Takaki says that the purpose of the Tidings-McDuffie Act was Filipino exclusion. As residents of an independent country rather than a U.S. territory, Filipinos would no longer have unrestricted entry to the United States. On the opposite side, Hawaiians have been denied sovereignty because their sugar and location, land and resources as like a tourist spot, their culture used, to kind of entice in this has been used, and sovereignty has been not denied to maintain this. But there are very different instances because that was for immigration versus the rights to the land themselves. I also found it really cool how Trask talks about and centers Hawaiians as indigenous peoples and their rights as indigenous peoples in contrast to Asian laborers who were settlers and Native Americans in the United States. She says that in practice, federal policy had straddled two poles, acknowledging Hawaiians as natives for some purposes, such as for educational and health programs, but refusing to grant them the privileges of native recognition in terms of self-government. She also talks about how children of Asian settlers claim Hawaii as their own, denying indigenous history, their long collaboration, and our continued dispossession, and how the substitution of the term local for immigrant is a celebrated American gloss for settler, which is an important nuance in this history of their colonization. And lastly, I thought it was really interesting to think about other time periods and the media portrayal of certain groups in reality. Choi says that when anti-Chinese sentiment intensified and the need arose to justify federal passage of a Chinese exclusion law, the Chinese became an inevitable target of political cartoonists. Used as strikebreakers against unions and in labor movements, the Chinese were depicted as an enemy of the working class. So while in this case the Chinese were actually like tools for the white capitalists and were painted as a monopolizing labor force, Hawaiians were have been portrayed as carefree natives, and when in reality their living situations have been severely lacking because of colonization. And I found it fitting to think about how Lindsay uses these different types of media portrayal in these shots, such as like the first two scenes of these kind of white settlers wearing Hawaiian dress, participating in Hawaiian culture, but being able to use camera work and film techniques through the use of zoom to highlight Hawaiian subjects in each of these, deny this portrayal of Hawaiians with this stereotype, and kind of get the truth throughout the different types of media, as well as in her narration. Right. So lastly, here is my works cited page. Thank you.